Topic 39, the new immigration, 1880 through 1924. You should take notes during this podcast, pausing it as necessary and listening to it as many times as you need to, as you'll need them to complete future graded assignments. I recommend that you take notes in the Cornell method of note-taking as presented in podcast 3 of this course. By the end of this podcast, you should be able to contrast immigration to the United States between 1880 and 1924 with previous migration waves, list the push and pull factors that drew the two biggest migrant groups to the U.S. during this period, and describe the early experiences of both groups in the U.S. during this time in at least a paragraph each. Once I thought to write a history of the immigrants in America, wrote Oscar Hanlon, one of the 20th century's most famous scholars of the history of United States immigrants. Then I discovered that the immigrants were American history. As we have seen, the land that was to become the U.S. was populated by myriad groups from abroad, from Spain and France in the 16th century, England, Scotland, and Netherlands in the 17th, Germany and Northern Ireland in the 18th, as well as from Africa throughout. By the early 19th century, the United States was already so diverse that its founding document, the Declaration of Independence, had been published in at least 2 different languages, English and German, so to reach the minds and hearts of America's varied inhabitants. Yet, newcomers' acculturation, or merging into American culture, at the same time changing that culture by adding bits of their own, has never been smooth, easy, or without controversy. One of the first immigrant groups to arouse widespread nativist suspicion and ire were the Irish migrants fleeing the potato blight and famine between 1845 and 9. Extremely poor and notably Catholic, as opposed to the nation's prior immigrants who, despite their national diversity, were usually Protestant, these Irish newcomers were also viewed as threatening because they arrived in such great numbers. Too poor to travel further westward, where land was cheap and manifest destiny pushing the U.S. into Indian and Mexican territories, most Irish settled into the urban centers along the Atlantic seaboard. As Irish enclaves in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia grew crowded, many native-born Americans, fearing Catholics' allegiance to the Pope and Rome, questioned the ability of Irish to remain loyal to democratic ideals. By the 1870s, Charles Darwin's theories about evolution seeped into the public consciousness, where they informed Americans' ideals about racial difference. Contemporary cartoonist Thomas Nast, affiliated with the late 19th century Republican Party, frequently caricaturized Irish, who were by and large members of the Democratic Party, as gorillas and monkeys. In California, where Chinese migrants helped build railroads, mine for gold, and supply burgeoning cities with vital goods and services, Irish immigrants ironically played a key part in urging passage of the nation's first immigration restriction law based on national ancestry, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Despite the fact that many Irish continued to migrate to the United States through the turn of the century and beyond, around 1880 they were joined by many others from Southern and Eastern Europe. These immigrants were thought of as new not only because they came from regions that had never sent many to the U.S. before, but also because they spoke no English, were Jewish or Catholic, and dressed and looked physically different from both native-born Americans as well as from Irish Catholics who had, by this time, enjoyed 2 generations of assimilation into American culture. Nevertheless, like migrants who preceded them for centuries, these new immigrants came to the U.S. for a complex set of push factors, conditions that propelled them out of their home countries, and pull factors, conditions that drew them to the U.S. as opposed to elsewhere. The most numerous of these new immigrant groups arrived from southern Italy. The nation-state of Italy had only been founded during the 1860s. The new Italian government did little to protect southern Italian peasants from being taken advantage of by wealthy, often absentee landowners from the north. As steamship technology advanced during the 19th century, tickets in steerage, or third-class sections below the deck, made it possible for mostly young Italian men to travel to the United States for several years. While here, these men often worked in construction and unskilled trades like garbage collecting in eastern cities like New York, mining in states like West Virginia and Colorado, and owing to their peasant backgrounds in Italy, in agriculture, living cheaply and sending money to wives and children back home in the small villages of Campania, Calabria, and Sicily throughout the Mezzogiorno. Often, these men went home for a few winter months after several years in the States and returned to the U.S. several times, earning the nickname Birds of Passage for the back and forth nature of their sojourns. In short, before 1900, most of these southern Italian men never intended to make the U.S. their permanent residence. Some earned the nickname Americani in their hometowns when they returned permanently and built large homes with the money they had earned by scrimping and saving over years in the U.S. Around 1900, however, as more and more Italian men began to view the U.S. as a place they could call home for good, they started to send for their wives and children to join them. Despite this decision, these new immigrants still suffered discrimination, both from native-born Protestant Americans who emphasized that 100% Americanism required that they abandon their Italian language and what they considered strange customs, like eating less meat and more vegetables, as well as more established Irish communities who rejected Italian Catholic practices and often favored Irish Americans in municipal patronage jobs. The second most populous immigrant group during the period were united by religion rather than national origin. Eastern European Jews arrived mostly from Poland and the Russian Empire, where they fled pogroms or violence against and destruction of Jewish businesses, homes, synagogues, and people. The severity of this violence pushed most Jews to emigrate as families from the start and to remain in their new country. The stability of a family, their permanent intentions, as well as the fact that most Jewish immigrants had lived in urban European centers prior to immigration, as opposed to Italians who often emigrated from the countryside, facilitated many Jewish immigrants' early acculturation to life in American cities such as New York. Once here, they utilized their literacy and prior skills to make marks in the needle trades, labor activism, and skilled professions. Nevertheless, like Italians who experienced discrimination from fellow Catholics, Eastern European Jews, especially Hasidim, were often looked down upon as provincial by more secular and modern German Jews who had largely arrived to the United States during the 1840s. Despite widespread anti-Semitism, anti-Catholic sentiment, racism, and nativism, immigrants from Italy, Poland, and elsewhere continued to flock to the United States in the 2 decades on either side of the year 1900, filling its need for laborers and transforming what we would come to think of as typically American culture. Immigration to the United States peaked in 1907 when 1.7 million migrants entered the country legally in just 1 year. Nevertheless, nativists in Congress and among the American public continued to call for restrictions on the numbers of newcomers who could enter the country during the 19-teens and early 20s. In 1924, Congress succeeded, passing the National Origins Act, which sharply curtailed immigration from anywhere but Northern and Western Europe, in an attempt to restore the racial balance of the country to pre-1890 percentages. Congress did not overhaul immigration legislation in any meaningful way until 1965. Review the learning objectives for this podcast. Write out each one in a sentence or paragraph now. If you find that you cannot do so, go back to the beginning of the podcast, listen and watch again, and pause it as necessary to supplement the notes you've already taken until you can easily answer all of the learning objectives on the screen now. Good luck!